Saul's Temple Sinai Religious School interview with Roger M. Meyer. Woo! Part 2.
Okay.
So
There were mostly Jewish kids around. Then I went off to college. I was 16.
yeah.
And I went to a school that had been founded by Episcopalians, and it still had a strong, it was a small college, but it still had a strong Episcopal tradition. But starting about 3 or 4 years before I got there, they had always had a mainly Protestant undergraduate body. But after the Second World War, there was something called the GI Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And so people who had served in the Second World War could get their education covered by the federal government. And so schools like Hobart filled with, they expanded their student body with these veterans from the Second World War.
Yeah.
But when I came along in 1954, that veteran wave was over, and it probably had ended sometime around 1950 or 51. And so they had to now begin to recruit students who were not mainstream Episcopalian or other Protestant groups. And so they started to recruit Jewish kids from New York. The problem was that the social life on that campus was around fraternities. And more than half of the fraternities did not take Jews. They were barred from taking Jewish students. And so many of the Jewish students in my class just dropped out after the first or second year because they felt that they weren't really enjoying college that much. But on the other hand, about 2 years before I got there, they had a requirement that we had to be either in chapel or 2 years earlier they opened up the requirements so that you could go to synagogue, or if you were Catholic, you'd go to a Catholic church. So we were required to go to synagogue, or a church if you chose to. We had to go to synagogue, and we had to have our attendance taken. There was one small synagogue in town, and we had to do that for 3 years. The other thing that happened was that we had what was called a survey course in the history of Western civilization. And so for the first time, I really read the Hebrew Bible. We also read the Christian Bible, but we read the Hebrew Bible. And between the course in Western civilization and going to synagogue every Friday night,
Yeah.
I became much more positively identified as Jewish. It wasn't simply a feeling of a disadvantage in terms of, like in New York, that we were going to get beaten up. It was a big feeling of pride and a greater feeling of identification.
You hear that, all of you? Jewish pride! Woo!
Next question. So those were the times. It's interesting. When I applied to medical school, so my parents' rabbi in Spring Valley said to them that Harvard Medical School no longer had a quota. They used to have a quota that restricted the number of Jews who could go there.
Wow.
And
you hear that?
Yeah.
Racist.
And right, it was. And they eliminated that quota, and so I applied, and I actually was the first person from my college ever to get in there.
Battlegrounds.
And then the bottom line was that still about 25 or 30% of my class were Jewish, so it had changed very dramatically in the 4 or 5 years before I started college.
Wow.
Did you know that Yale, until around 1962, the place that your both parents went, had quotas until about 1962?
Wow. So apparently a lot of colleges were rather racist, so
Yeah.
you
well,
should be thankful for what you've got now.
Yeah. And the only African Americans in my class were 2 or 3 people who played football.
See, more racism.
Go on.
So, you see, was being Jewish, like, how did you feel about synagogue when you were my age?
Well, when I was your age, I was preparing for a bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
And I felt like, oh my goodness, I was bar mitzvah in the 9th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I figured, oh my goodness, I'm carrying all this schoolwork that I have to do. Up to that point I was taking piano lessons, and I felt, oh, this is such a burden. But then I had my bar mitzvah, and it was very meaningful. I had my bar mitzvah January 27th, 1951.
Did you enjoy Hebrew school while you were young?
No.
An honest answer.
Right. Well, I don't think that, I mean, I think that the sense that I got when I was in college was the value of going to synagogue every Friday night and the experience of really reading the Hebrew Bible and really getting a sense of the beauty of the language and the importance of the Hebrew prophets.
All right. So,
the other thing that I have to say is that in 1948, in May 1948, Israel declared its self as state, its independence, and that was a real moment of pride
for
for
you?
me and for my family. And when I was in college, we used to, hear about these. And before that, I mean, from 1948, the war, and we were all worried about whether Israel would survive. And then after the war, there were all these attacks that would come in, attacks of terrorism. And they were getting more and more violent. And in 1956, when I was in college, Israel and joined with Britain and France against Egypt. And there was a guy in our dormitory before that event who used to enjoy running down the hall, guns for the Arabs, sneakers for the Jews, that the Jews should run away and that the Arabs should kill them. So there was a certain amount of public anti-Semitism, but I have to say that in the faculty that I had in college, a number of them really were very, very nice to Jewish kids.
All right, so Grandpa, here's a biggie.
Yeah.
So, what did and what does being Jewish mean to you, and why?
Well, it's complicated because I have a daughter who's a rabbi, and that has had a very, very, very affirming influence on my feelings. Grandma and I love to go to synagogue where she works, and I find myself re-experiencing some of the spiritual feelings that I had when I was in college. Because I would say that in terms of the period of time when I felt the most spiritual connection was in college, and also when my kids were growing up, and with their bat mitzvahs. That was also a very connected time. But, I had a very limited Jewish education. We were members of a Reform synagogue from 1949 until 1951 when I was bar mitzvah. But my parents weren't very active, and it was really, they joined for that purpose. But when my parents moved out of the city, and they moved to an area, it happened that there were very few Jews in the area they were living, they became members of a synagogue in a neighboring city, a neighboring village, and they became very active. My father sang in the choir, and my grandmother would go with my dad every Saturday for the Havara group. And actually, when your mom was visiting with them, they would take her, and she went with them, and I think it meant a lot to her.
Mhm. So, when you were a kid, what did being Jewish mean? Like, just continuing on that question.
Well, it's funny. When I was 4 years old, my parents were looking for an apartment. We were at that time living with my grandparents. We were all living in this rather small apartment, and my dad wanted to have an apartment of his own. So we were looking for apartments in this neighborhood, and I noticed that my parents sometimes went into one building, but they didn't go into another, but all the buildings had apartment for lease on them. And I said to my parents, well, why aren't you going into that building? And they said, oh, those buildings only take blue bloods. And I thought to myself at 4 years old, blue bloods?
So people who have extremely deoxygenated blood?
Well, no, it was an expression that, that the people who were so upper crust and clearly not Jewish, they were blue bloods. But I thought, oh my goodness, we couldn't go there because we had red blood. Everybody in my family had red blood. But so I was aware of exclusions, and I was aware that my parents were aware that there were certain companies that didn't hire Jewish people, certain supermarket chains like A&P and Grand Union, and the telephone company at that time, AT&T, that there were certain companies that hired Jews and certain companies that didn't. I remember when my parents were wanting to go away on a vacation once, and they knew that particular resorts, the Jewish people couldn't go there.
Wow. I mean, I know that my other half of my family, the Chinese half, I mean, they were able to find jobs without that much exclusion, but like, instead of job companies not wanting them, I think it might have been the like rank that they were allowed to go to, because like my grandpa worked as like a bartender at the Oyster Bar.
Right.
And was a union worker. Would that kind of opportunity be available for your parents?
My grandparents. My grandparents were like my grandparents were like your grandparents, like your Chinese grandparents. And that is, my grandfather came here when he was 13 years old in 1895. And he lived with his father in a room in a tenement on the Lower East Side. There was a single bathroom for all of the tenants, and the only place they could bathe was at a public bathhouse across the street. And my grandfather worked from the time that he came here until he retired at 65. He did basically manual labor, and so there was a period before the Depression when he and my grandmother opened up a ladies' clothing store, but the store couldn't survive the Depression. But my grandfather was self-taught in English. He didn't have any schooling in the United States, and my grandmother was essentially illiterate. She couldn't read, but they both worked. My grandmother worked into her 70s. She was a flower maker. She made feather and paper flowers for basically in factories.
So by manual labor, as you said earlier, what kind of job, manual labor can extend to a lot of things?
Yeah, but like my grandfather worked for a company, he was a box cutter. And he worked in the textile industry. And when he worked in the textile industry, he did belong to a union. But when he worked as a box cutter, the employees wanted to form a union, and the boss fired everybody.
So the boss fired everybody because they didn't want to
have a union.
Why? Because I know from...
They'd have to pay higher wages, and they might have to have other benefits. But no, my grandparents, my grandparents' generation and my parents' generation really suffered